Hi, good evening, or rather good morning to friends and colleagues in Canada. Good evening to any night owls who are still up with us here in Asia. My name is Joshua Brown, and anybody who's been calling in to the Canada-ASEAN Week webinars this week, this story will be beginning to sound very familiar. I am our Tractus country manager for Singapore. I've been based here since 2015 and manage a portfolio of primarily regionally focused clients. I'm a member of our strategy and implementation and corporate finance practices, but also work extensively with our economic development clients. I'm not going to go into as great detail of introduction as I have historically this week, but I'll just say that before relocating to Singapore, I opened and managed the growth of our Myanmar office. I spent approximately 3 years there between 2012 and 2015, and before that spent time working for an agency in the Malaysian Prime Minister's Department, working mostly on issues of industry, government, high technology, industrial collaboration internationally. While I've got a captive audience, I'm also excited to share with the group that I'll be repatriating to Toronto in January. I'll stay on with Tractus, so I'll be in a new role as our first ever Chief Rep for Canada. I'm also excited to share that I'll be continuing in my service of the Management Committee of the Canada-ASEAN Business Council, although I will take on a new role there as well as our Canada Activities Chair, and look forward to engaging with this group and others in the public and private sector in the coming years in both those capacities. I don't want to belabor this too much because I think it's become quite familiar to many of the repeat attendees of the Canada-ASEAN Week webinars, but what I'll say is that Tractus is a Asia-focused business advisory firm. We have a 20-year history serving clients across 8 offices in mostly developing Asia. I say mostly with the exception of Singapore, which is a very advanced economy, as we'll discuss tonight. In the time that Tractus has been servicing clients, we've worked on more than 1,000 projects that have been serviced by our approximately 60 or 70 full-time employees, and those projects have included work for private sector companies entering and expanding in Asian markets. It's included economic development organizations focused on the promotion of trade and attraction of foreign investment, and particularly and last but not least, of course, work through our corporate finance practice, focus on the promotion of companies looking to raise capital in Asia, attract buyers for their businesses, or acquire or merge with businesses in Asia to fuel further growth. Something that we're particularly proud of is that across that range of practices and the projects that we've done, we've helped to facilitate more than $5 billion of foreign direct investment, both into our client geographies and for our clients investing in Asia. We placed Singapore at the end of the week-long Canada-ASEAN webinar series quite intentionally. The city-state is an extremely unique country and has a very unique role not only regionally but around the world, and that's something that we'll dig into in the presentation. When Singapore celebrated its 50th anniversary as an independent nation last year, observers, including myself, really marveled at the progress that Singapore has made from a one-time sleepy fishing village to what is today a global capital for finance and a center for trade. It's got one of the highest incomes in the world, and in fact, that income per capita is nearly double that of Canada. Singapore's income per capita is almost $82,000 US versus about $44,000 US in Canada, and its population is more productive than Japan and nearly 3 times as productive as the next most productive country in Southeast Asia, which is Malaysia. That said, it's got some room to grow and some headroom certainly to achieve what Canada has achieved. Canada is significantly more productive at $50 worth of GDP per hour worked compared to Singapore's 40 or 41 or $42. But Singapore has achieved that kind of productivity output with no dependency on national resources. Indeed, the country's got a tiny population. Singapore's population is just over 5 million, and that includes 1.4 million foreign workers, almost a third of the population. That accounts amongst them expatriate executives who earn an average income of a whopping approximately $193,000 Canadian, certainly more than the average Canadian executive. The tremendous growth that the country's seen over the past 50 years has been driven historically and principally by investment. That investment includes $65 billion in net capital inflows annually, and Singapore registered $643.7 billion worth of goods flowing in and out of the country in 2015. That compares quite impressively with Canada's bilateral import-export trade of $828 billion, and particularly impressively when you consider that of Canada's $828 billion, almost $78 billion was energy exports. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Singapore-Canadian bilateral relationship. Canada was amongst the first nation states to recognize Singapore as a state after it gained independence in 1965. And while that's fantastic, the fact that that talking point has stuck around and continues to be so well known, in my view, points to a relative lack of excitement about Canada-Singapore bilateral relations today. Those bilateral relations can probably be historically categorized in what is, frankly, a very Singaporean-Canadian way as stable, but perhaps a little bit boring. Despite being Canada's second largest export partner in ASEAN, bilateral trade between the two is pretty modest. In 2015, Singapore took nearly $1.2 billion of Canada's $408 billion in exports. In other words, less than 0.5%. And none of Canada's top 10 exports to Singapore make up more than 1% of Singapore's total imports in that product category. And what that tells us is that Canadian companies, despite Singapore being important in the framework of ASEAN, really don't have a significant market share amongst Singaporean exports. Some of that has probably contributed to the pragmatism that saw a 2009 decision to suspend bilateral FTA talks. Those talks were suspended in favor of a more regional Canada-ASEAN approach, and that Canada-ASEAN approach has had some new life breathed into it. Our Canadian Trade Minister, Chrystia Freeland, helped to do that when she attended the Lao-ASEAN Economic Ministers Dialogue this year and committed her support to advancing some of the dialogue that's taken place around a Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement. I don't want to sound too dour, however. Canadian companies have both made key investments in Singapore and won significant contracts. In 2012, for example, Bell Helicopter, which manufactures its entire range of civilian vertical lift aircraft in Canada, opened a 160,000 square foot MRO facility in Singapore's Seletar Aerospace Park, and Bombardier Aerospace followed suit approximately 2 years later, 2014, opening its own MRO center in the same aerospace park. On the government tender side, Bombardier Transportation, the aircraft maker's sister company, which manufactures trains and other transport equipment, won a 570 million Sing dollar contract, which is these days about on par with the Canadian dollar for those who may not know. And more recently, a 120 million Sing dollar contract for the supply of rolling stock to the Land Transport Authority. Those types of wins aren't exclusively restricted to OEM equipment producers. Canadians are also making inroads in Singapore's service sector in areas like financial services. And Manulife signed a 15-year regional distribution agreement this year with DBS Bank, which I believe is Singapore's largest bank, that commits the two organizations to a partnership around the distribution of insurance products, not only in Singapore, but also in Hong Kong, China, and Indonesia. Jumping ahead, I'll talk a little bit about trade. Canada registered a trade surplus with Singapore for the first time in 2012 and have really trended at an extremely stable CAGR of 3.8%. Those export volumes dipped slightly after 2008, like most exports after the global financial and economic crisis. But Singapore exports to Canada, on the other hand, have experienced much more significant gestation, despite having a similar long-term CAGR. Those Singaporean exports rose steeply between 2006 and 2009 and fell sharply after 2009. What our view on the matter is that a lot of those changes have been affected by evolving industrial dynamics. We've seen the pharmaceutical and semiconductor markets, manufacturing sectors in particular, which were strongly encouraged by government policy in the late 1990s and 2000s, wane, and a lot of that manufacture relocated to lower cost centers and places like China and in particular Malaysia. In terms of what Canada exports to Singapore, we see a lot of turbines and power generation, turbojets, turbopropellers for aerospace, things like semiconductors, mobile handsets, specialized sensor and analysis equipment, especially for medical applications, as well, of course, as aerospace parts and equipment. Those Canadian export volumes to Singapore totaled about 1.1 billion in 2015, which made Singapore the largest, their second largest market for Canadian goods in Southeast Asia, where Singapore trailed only Indonesia, which took about $1.4 billion for the Canadian products. Those are US dollar figures, and which makes Singapore almost twice as large a market for Canadian exports as Thailand or Malaysia, which are the third and fourth largest export markets for Canadian products in the region, respectively. It's worth noting, though, that Singapore happens to be the largest exporter to ASEAN countries. It provides some 26% or $66 billion worth of ASEAN country imports, which is very clear evidence to us of the importance of Singapore as a major trading hub. This is particularly true, in fact, for semiconductors and handsets, which are both items which Canada excels in exporting to Singapore, and to a lesser extent, industrial machinery and equipment. In terms of what Singapore exports to Canada, it's mostly semiconductors, turbines for power generation, again, turbojets and turbopropellers for aerospace, refined petroleum oil from the refinery sector that we'll talk about later, and medical devices where Singapore has carved out a very impressive niche. With the exception of exports of niche chemicals, which have taken off on a relative basis, Singapore's 10 largest export categories to Canada have either grown very slowly in recent years or actually declined in several cases, including in some of the largest export categories such as electromechanical and mechanical machinery and electrical appliances. When we take that same chart and exclude niche chemicals, what we see is only garments, which accounted for just $18 million or approximately 0.5 or 0.4% of Canada's $4.7 billion garment import market. Only that category has really grown significantly in the last 10 years. There are some smaller export niche categories in areas like sports and recreation equipment, explosive and polytechnic goods that have made inroads and seen large-scale growth over the last 3 years, but those are nominally very small, really between $1 million and, in the case of sports and recreation equipment, just $2.4 million in the most recent year. While that's true, and while Canadian exports to Singapore have fallen, hurt primarily by declines in our largest export categories, which are electrical machinery and mechanical appliances, Singapore, if you take a step back, has really remained a relatively resilient export market for Canadian goods, and the decline in exports to Singapore has really fallen only half as much as total Canadian exports to the world, which were down 9% during the same period. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult for us really to just choose 4 sectors only that present opportunities, particularly given the small group webinar format of this presentation and the diversity amongst the audience. But we'd like to point out a couple of things. First of all, Singapore is an extremely advanced economy with tremendous regional relevance. It's got a thriving service sector, an extremely competitive advanced manufacturing and research and development sector, and is a vital Asian, if not global, financial services center. I am going to present on 4 specific industry areas, but what I want to do is make an effort to frame them in the context of the types of opportunities that are present for Canadian companies that may be interested in the Singaporean market. Let's start with aerospace. Clearly an area where Canada is extremely competitive. It won't be news to many in the group that air travel in Asia Pacific has grown and continues to grow at an extremely rapid pace. And I've charted this here. You can see that air traffic in the region is growing at something like 9.4% year over year. If you look at some of the announcements from the largest aerospace or aircraft manufacturers in the world, Airbus and Boeing, you will see that they expect over 1/3 of their worldwide aircraft deliveries to go to Asia in the next 2 decades. And by 2031, that would bring Asia Pacific's fleet up to 13,500 aircraft. Singapore is definitely in a good place to benefit from that overall regional dynamic. It's backed by a pool of more than 100 aerospace companies and has already captured 1/4 of the Asian MRO market. MRO certainly is not the end of the story. Singapore has also seen a growing number of aerospace design and manufacturing operations, and what we're seeing as a firm is companies increasingly seeking to leverage off of Singapore's very strong historical capabilities in areas of precision engineering, advanced electronics, in the support of production of more complex aero engine components. I'll give you a couple examples. Rolls-Royce in 2012 made a major investment into its Seletar campus. That was an investment not only in engine assembly and testing, but also training, R&D, and is a global production center for the company's titanium wide chord fan blade manufacturing operations. A year later, Pratt & Whitney, which has major operations in Canada, broke ground on its first geared turbo fan hybrid fan blade and turbine disc manufacturing facility. That was its first outside of the U.S. And these examples are not exclusive of Canadian companies. As we've talked about, Canadian companies as well have invested in the space. As discussed earlier, Bombardier and the let's call it quasi-Canadian Bell Helicopter operate regional centers in Singapore, as does CAE. While aerospace industries are an obvious sector for Canadian firms, given, for example, the country's strength in that space, the sector is really and can be broadly categorized as a proxy for regional advanced industrial manufacturing industries. Whether it's aerospace or others, the high growth markets of Southeast Asia and the expanding demand for industrial equipment and machinery, some of which we've seen in the trade data earlier, is going to help to drive that demand for after-sales service and support, including MRO, not only for aerospace, but for adjacent industries as well. Many companies in that category are finding Singapore to be an ideal location to service the region from. And both companies who invest and companies as well who service the supply chains of those who do invest are going to stand to benefit. I put up some information here about the energy sector, but what I'd really like to talk about is the broader opportunity in the energy and infrastructure space, basically large-scale big projects. Singapore has become one of the largest shipping hubs in the world and is home to the largest bunker fuel facility in the world. Its refineries produce more than 1.3 billion barrels per day, or approximately 1.5% of world capacity. That's some sort of information on the major logistical and energy infrastructure that exists in the city-state, but at the same time, as a highly urbanized city-state with very limited natural resources, Singapore's also been an early adopter of sustainable energy alternatives. And with little or no natural resources to rely on, Singapore has really been at the cutting edge of adopting an integrated approach towards sustainable energy management across power generation, transmission, distribution, and consumption. Part of that is a reflection of the opportunities that are going to be available to companies in the clean tech space, sustainable energy, companies in the energy efficiency business, and really companies with technologies that can make more productive use of Singapore's limited land bank and energy resources. Like our aerospace example, I think our energy sector example makes for a good proxy for more broad-based opportunities in the infrastructure sector, not only in Singapore, but from across the region. In the field of infrastructure, for example, Singapore is really regarded as the leading Asian infrastructure hub for the development, finance, implementation of projects across the region. A lot of the regional expertise that's required to implement those types of projects is here, and companies that are based here have become very effective at tapping Singapore's capabilities in infrastructure development and the ecosystem of specialized financial institutions, which are really global leaders on cross-border project financing and in the professional services space for the development of projects in Asia. Advanced manufacturing capabilities have also helped to attract high-tech investments and the supporting infrastructure and industry supply chains that make Singapore a very competitive place to manufacture high-value goods. We could have opted to talk about any of Singapore's high technology manufacturing clusters, and there are many, such as in the medical device or advanced electronics space. But instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the critical enablers that make Singapore such an attractive location for industries such as aerospace, oil and gas, medical devices, electronics, and others. It wasn't an overnight success. Singapore has moved in very clear, specific, deliberate steps guided by a very effective and forward-looking government. Its precision engineering activities began as far back as the 1970s, which was a push by the government to support the first manufacturing investments. And between now and then, there are now 2,700 companies ranging from SMEs and up into and including some of the larger multinational companies that we spoke about in the precision engineering sector. Beyond just manufacturing, Singapore also plays host now to a large number of Asia-Pacific or global headquarters and R&D functions for many of these companies. Singapore's electronics industry, for example, is world-class. It's an innovation-driven hub that provides technology, manufacturing, and business solutions, all of which that have helped to enable the development of new growth areas in which Singapore has been a pioneer. Evidence of that is that Singapore accounts for 1 in 10 of wafer starts in the world, and as much as 40% of all global hard disk media manufactured around the globe. Key products outside of those include really mission-critical infrastructure, things like secure computing systems, high-end servers, ATMs, point-of-sale systems, other information communications products like networking equipment and smart cards. And Singapore is really well suited in our view to that kind of production because of its high quality, high mix, low volume manufacturing expertise that is deeply supported by an established ecosystem for precision components. An area that I'm particularly excited about, an area that we do a lot of work for through our corporate finance practice, raising money for when developing Asia strategy and raising money for Western companies in Asia is the evolving private equity and venture capital space in Singapore. It'll be a surprise to no one that Singapore is a regional hub for financial services. Most people know that the city has long been a contender with Hong Kong for the top spot in Asia for financial services. But what's gone less recognized, I think, is the emergence of Singapore as a major player in the private equity space in Asia. Data suggests that private equity and venture capital assets under management in Southeast Asia grew by about 8.7% in 2015, the latest year that data is available. And PE firms between 2014 and early 2016 accounted for $14 billion in buyout transactions. That activity is almost exclusively coming out of Singapore. While innovation hubs like those in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal are looking for solutions to Canada's risk capital gap, which has been well addressed by the Jenkins report and subsequently tackled by the federal and provincial governments, Asian limited partner style investors, in our view, offer a really important and perhaps unrealized source of institutional capital, as well as private, high, and ultra high net worth individual capital, both for Canadian venture firms and perhaps more relevantly for this audience, early stage and growth stage companies going through the turnaround process or otherwise seeking capital. Singapore is home to a large network of corporate strategics and PE funds that do have increasingly so an appetite for North American diversification. They have an appetite for the types of reasonable valuations that the Toronto Waterloo Technology Corridor presents, perhaps in contrast to more overheated valuations in places like Silicon Valley. And these groups can help to create exit opportunities for mid-market Canadian firms, and in our experience, are an extremely valuable source of growth capital, in particular for firms that have Asian growth market ambitions and would benefit from having institutional or individual investors that can help to unlock and help companies navigate the sometimes opaque waters of Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that Singapore is facing as well. While we've talked in some detail now about opportunity, that opportunity is also perhaps challenged by some evidence of stagnation in the Singapore economy. What this chart shows is that the Singapore economy really did grow at quite a healthy clip of about 5% year over year over the last decade, but it struggled to exceed between 1 and 2% GDP in more recent years. In very typical Singapore fashion, the government has set out a top-down policy and put in place measures to help overcome some of that lackluster growth. Their goal is to return Singapore to between 3 and 5% GDP growth year over year through three main pillars: through the upskilling and continuing education of workers, through investments in innovation and commercialization, and through investments and measures intended to improve productivity and expand companies internationally through trade and foreign direct investment. Economists on the call might be looking at this chart, you know, a little bit cross-eyed. It may seem peculiar to some that GDP in this case is actually lower than exports and imports. Singapore is in a very unique position because of its small size. Instead of trying to be self-sufficient and produce all the goods that the country needs, it's able to specialize in a few highly profitable industries. And these industries produce more money than exports or imports, then exports or imports could contribute to the entire domestic economy. Because of this peculiar dynamic, which is really unique to small city-states like Luxembourg or Singapore, that money from exports allows them to purchase imports in excess of what their domestic economy would otherwise be able to produce. So It just seems a little bit peculiar to anyone. That's why. All that opportunity, is excited about it as we are, does have some challenges. That said, we're very optimistic about Singapore's ability to make this shift. Being a city-state with a government with a proven track record of developing and implementing best practice policy programs, it's our view, at least, that Singapore is nimble enough to make these structural changes to its economy without too much difficulty. As you can see here, and what you would have heard throughout the week, is that Singapore is actually ranked #1 in the ease of doing business, and it has almost complete absence of political risk, violence, or terrorism. I've already touched on a lot of the business-to-consumer and business-to-business opportunity that we see. So instead of repeating myself, what I'd like to do instead is talk in brief about Singapore's unique value proposition as a jumping off point for regional business expansion. Like their peers and the many firms that have found success in Singapore, many Canadian businesses use agents or distributors to serve not only the Singaporean market, but also regional markets. Singapore's open and advanced economy and the absence of corruption that categorizes it has helped Western businesses approach and easily identify market expansion partners. And Singaporean companies have a deep tradition and long history of helping foreign trading partners go to, enter, and expand their product offering in regional markets. Those same Singaporeans are typically very aggressive when it comes to representing new products and are very typically responding enthusiastically to new opportunities that we present when we help our clients go through the business-to-business matching process of linking up with distributors in the market. All that to say, Canadian companies should really plan on having an excellent after-sales service support program and focus on providing a high-touch commitment with local partners. That doesn't just mean frequent trips, but also product knowledge training and extremely regular engagement to support, grow, and help distributors be successful in the markets that you're working with them to tackle. Just as exporters are finding themselves gaining traction in Singapore with distributors, as that business grows, many will opt to set up a representative office or incorporate a local entity. That's very easy to do in Singapore, and there are very few barriers to entry for foreign direct investment. The country's incredible ease of doing business that we've already talked about, its integrated supply chains, its hard and soft infrastructure, and its access to talent makes Singapore a really excellent place from which to launch and manage a regional business. One area that's particularly evident, I think, to most is the professional services space and the opportunity to manage a regional business operation from Singapore. But in our experience as location strategy advisors on both manufacturing and services operations, Singapore continues to constantly be ranked highly for advanced engineering and manufacturing businesses and anything where you're providing a really high value product or service. So that could be in the case of shared service centers, for example, a global center of excellence for M&A. In the case of manufacturing, anything that requires a very high degree of talent or is prone to or susceptible to productivity improvements through automation and advanced technology improvements. In summation, I'll just walk through a couple of the major items around Singapore's SWOT matrix. The country's a global leader. That's almost without debate in terms of ease of doing business, and it's ranked constantly #1 by the World Bank in its ease of doing business index. It's got a forward-looking government that's extremely effective at policy planning organization and has committed very clearly to a focus on innovation, productivity, and internationalization for the coming decade. And its place at the center of ASEAN make it a prime trading location for entering and growing in new markets. All of that, though, its attraction as a place for doing business comes at a cost, very literally at a cost. Singapore is one of the most expensive places in the world to work and do business, and that's a challenge that all companies face and many struggle to overcome. If its future planning objectives are successful, which we do think they will be, Singapore has an opportunity to become more productive, more innovative, and critically to dominate a strong regional position. That goal of becoming a strong dominant player is aided by a head start on its neighbors, many of which are mired in the middle income trap, or in the case of the less developed countries, far behind where Singapore is today. So in summation, incredibly advanced economy, a lot going on, very strong policy planning and implementation amongst the government, very high ease of doing business, extremely high cost, with some challenges ahead, but all to be taken with a healthy dose of optimism in our professional view. I'm producing today's session on my own for the first time this week. We are and will take questions via the questions panel in the GoToWebinar application. I'm happy to take any questions if there are, but we can perhaps start by responding to the first one that's come in about the ability of companies to manage Malaysia from Singapore. I think it's been relatively well addressed, but I'll revisit a couple of points. Singapore is a very strong regional management location for a couple of reasons. Malaysia is in particularly a prime target for companies that are expanding outside of Singapore for the first time. If for no other reason than the history of an extremely strong trading relationship and close geographical proximity. But Singaporean agents, distributors who are the types of partners that Canadian companies link up with have often 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years or more of regional trading experience with their peers in the region, and as a result, the country makes for a great jumping off point for managing regional business. The other question that's come in, and I'll take a couple more if there are questions, but the other question that's come in here is what kind of investments are Singaporean-based VCs and PE firms investing in? Singapore is a relatively new VC market. That said, it's very quickly establishing dominance in the region for venture-backed investing. It has predominantly been a Singapore for Southeast Asia VC market, where funds are being set up to allow LPs to invest in and capture some of the growth dynamics made available by fast economic growth in the region. But what we're seeing in more recent years is the emergence of funds like iGlobe Partners or Wavemaker, some of the others that have established really strong ties to some of the best VCs in the Valley and are co-investing alongside the likes of Sequoia Capital, DJF, Greylock, and some other really fantastic VCs, and doing deals and participating actively in deals in the US and perhaps even in Canada. If there are no other questions, I would just like to wrap up by saying thank you one more time. We've had an amazing audience across the week. We had more than 210 registrations for the program this week, and really appreciate a lot of the questions that have come in from people during the program. We've really appreciated some of the positive feedback that we've had, and encourage anyone who's interested in following up or getting questions answered that we weren't able to answer live to be in touch directly. A final key thank you to the Canadian Trade Commission, to some of the economic development organizations that have supported our program, to the Canadian Chambers of Commerce, the Asia Pacific Foundation, the Canada-ASEAN Business Council, who have all been absolutely terrific partners and big supporters of the program. So thank you again for your questions and for your participation. We really are grateful for you taking the time to get on, and look forward to keeping in touch. As I mentioned at the start of the broadcast, I'll be repatriating to Toronto in January, continued service of Tractus as our first ever Chief Representative for Canada, and hope to engage and to continue to dialogue with both Canadian private and public sector partners in that capacity. Wishing you a very good day and happy holidays. Enjoy the festive season, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.